Alright, so then follicle development. So how do we even get to that point? How do we get to this whole like meiosis 1, meiosis 2, and fertilization? We have to talk about how you even put the ball into play. How do you even ovulate and get this egg into the fallopian tubes? So I like this picture because this is the martini version. It's kind of squashed. So I like this one from McGraw-Hill. It's kind of like a clock. Now, is this all happening at once? No, it's just showing you the progression and development of these follicles in which these ova develop. So primordial follicles are what they start out with, and then it goes from primary to secondary, and then tertiary follicles. Actually, it's not listed here. But what you see is the oocyte starts to develop in these follicles, and these follicles get bigger and bigger, and also builds up this fluid in this space we call the antrum. And then with ovulation, this structure ruptures, so it kind of like pops. And then it releases the egg and the primary oocyte, and what happens is now it's a secondary oocyte. That's what happens during this whole development. Then it goes from primary oocyte to secondary oocyte, and now this leftover follicle becomes, now is it just spent? Well, the interesting thing is that this corpus luteum is, well, there's no more egg in it, so it's kind of like almost like scar tissue, but it actually has a very important endocrine function. And then it finally becomes something that's replaced with collagen, and this is why it becomes white, and this is why we call it at this point corpus albicans. So now it's more like the scar tissue. But again, can you regenerate an egg in that? No, again, remember that mitosis occurred before birth, and this is already past birth. So once a follicle is spent and you release this oocyte, there's no regeneration. So yet another reason why a woman is born with all the eggs she'll ever have. Now what happens is now we get to finally talk about the menstrual cycle. Okay, so there's a lot going on here, and we just kind of briefly went over the ovarian cycle. So how follicles go from primary to secondary to tertiary, and then ovulation, forming the corpus luteum, and then eventually the corpus albicans. But what do we see in the rest? Well, over here we see hormones, including gonadotropin-releasing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, estrogens. The primary one is estradiol, progesterone, and this new one that we didn't really talk about yet called inhibin. So what we see here is that the ovaries are being affected, and so is the uterus itself. So the ovarian cycle refers to the development of the follicles, and uterine cycle refers to the changes inside the endometrium of the uterus. Actually, the myometrium is affected as well, but we'll get to that when we cross that road when we get to it. Okay, so what happens to ovarian hormones? Well, they increase and decrease, increase and decrease. Now, do I want you to know exact values? Not really, but I think the easiest way to kind of it's a lot to take in at first, but the way I like to think about it is like, okay, I like to draw, this is why I like to draw it out, because there's a lot of information, but estrogens, and especially estradiol and progesterone, they have their specific functions in the uterus and ovary and in the whole gonadal axis for hormones in a woman. True or false? Most women have a menstrual cycle of 28 days. But you often hear this term thrown around, and heck, our textbook says 28 days in the figures. But is that true? Do most women have a menstrual cycle of 28 days? Okay, what do people say? Let's see the responses. So, so 58% say true, 42% say roughly 42% is false. So who wins? Who is correct? Well, the interesting thing is that let's look at the stats. Now, I surveyed previous classes, and it was all anonymous, so I didn't collect any personal information. But I just surveyed the classes in 2019 and 2020. How long, or if they're, of course, female, like how long is it between the start of menstruation? So when they start their period, how long is it between the start of each period? So what they said is like the ones that said 28 days exactly, well, you notice that 28 days exact, yeah, there's quite a few, but it's far from the majority. In fact, there's a population that actually beats out the 28 days. And what we see here is that, well, so if it would be kind of like choppy if I just surveyed everything, but 8 days exact, yeah, there were a lot of students, but the most popular option was actually a little longer, so 1 to 3 days longer than 28 days. So the thing about that is that I go with 28 days. Why? Because it's easily divisible by 4, and roughly the menstrual cycle can be broken down into 4, like by weeks. So again, like how many weeks in a month? Typical month, like 4-ish weeks, right? So 7 times 4 is 28. So that's mostly why you see in typical basic physiology books, why you see that 28 days. So again, just because you don't have 28 days, if you have a menstrual cycle, doesn't mean you're not normal. In fact, the most common thing, but what we see here is a big range as well. And some women, they actually have menstrual cycles more than 40 days, or sometimes fewer than 15. So what about the science? Did anyone do a survey? Well, the interesting thing is that someone did do a big survey, and what they did is measure more than 6,000 or 600,000. So 600,000 menstrual cycles, so 0.6 million women. And what they did is that they analyzed the ovulatory cycle, and what they found is that the average length of this menstrual cycle was 29.3 days. So actually our class data kind of coincides with this study, although this study has much more power in terms of statistics because it's way bigger than a physiology class. So the average woman's menstrual cycle is a little longer than 28 days. But for teaching purposes, we'll go with 28 days because it's kind of easy to break down changes of the menstrual cycle by week. And again, 4 times 7 is 28. So this is why, rather than having to do crazy math and then divide 29 by 4 or divide 29, multiply 29 by 1/4 and 3/4. So we will go with 28 days. But again, what we saw is that it can be longer than 40. It can be shorter than 2 weeks. So there is a big range in menstrual cycle length. Okay, so then this is the menstrual cycle. Again, this 28-day stuff is just more for simplicity's sake. And the thing about ovulation is that where do you think no-say occurs? Ovulation occurs roughly at the midpoint. So you don't have to memorize 14.5 days because again, it's like, okay, what? So it's easier to just know roughly around the midpoint of menstrual cycle, this is where ovulation occurs. So for those women who say have a 14-day menstrual cycle, it might happen around day 7 of their menstrual cycle. But what we have here is that we have hormonal and do other science courses use 28 days? Yeah. So 28 days is pretty common, but I want to kind of get it in your mind that just because yours isn't 28 days doesn't mean you're not normal. In fact, the average, and what is normal anyway? There's a range. It's not just 28 days, and then if you're 1 or 2 days more, you're late or something. So again, it is average menstrual cycle length is a little longer than 28 days, but for teaching purposes, 28 is around the right is a common range. Okay, so then you have the follicular phase, and what's happening during the follicular phase? Well, notice that all these follicles are developing and these hormones are increasing. And in fact, this hormone, which isn't being shown yet, well, that's gonadotropin releasing hormone, and the pulse frequency is kind of interesting. So what it's talking about is like gonadotropin releasing hormone. It doesn't just gradually build up. It actually occurs in short bursts. So what happens at these bursts is kind of like getting text messages, like very few messages from GnRH. But as it gets here, it starts to send more and more spikes in pulse until it gets really frequent, right next to as you approach the ovulation, or around the midpoint of a menstrual cycle and closer to ovulation.